We humans have been enthusiastically hitting each other for so shockingly long that war feels far less like a clever human invention and much more like a terribly toxic family tradition that absolutely nobody remembers starting. Yet, somewhere in the misty depths of deep prehistory, the nature of violence underwent a profound and sinister upgrade. One hangry individual clobbering another over a coveted piece of mammoth meat is merely a squabble. 10 highly organized people stealthily surrounding an unsuspecting rival camp at the crack of dawn is something entirely different. Mix in a bit of strategic planning, a few trusty allies, some pointy weapons, a healthy dash of generational revenge, and a highly suspicious interest in a neighbor's prime real estate. And congratulations! Humanity had officially invented organized warfare. The historical catch, of course, is that these pioneering prehistoric warriors left behind absolutely no detailed battle reports, no boastful carved victory speeches, and certainly no smugly exhausted kings announcing on ancient television that the entire operation had gone exactly as planned. Instead, they left behind shattered bones, fragmented weapons, grim mass graves, and a baffling, frustrating mystery that modern archaeologists are still passionately arguing about over their morning coffee. So, when exactly did our ancestors first decide to go to war? Was this bloody habit born among wandering, perpetually hungry groups of hunter-gatherers bickering desperately over scarce water holes and territory? Or did warfare only become truly, beautifully systematic after the dawn of farming generously gave humanity private land, stockpiles of grain, domesticated livestock, and several highly compelling reasons to completely stop sharing? The answer reaches incredibly far deeper into our murky past than the arrival of formal armies, sprawling cities, or civilization itself. Oddly enough, before humans could successfully go to war, we first had to become exceptionally, almost miraculously good at cooperating with one another. That sounds entirely backwards, of course, but organized war is certainly not just simple animal aggression with shinier branding. To be fair, plenty of other animals aggressively attack their rivals. Fierce chimpanzees regularly patrol their territorial borders and will occasionally, cold-bloodedly murder isolated members of neighboring troops. Packs of wolves fiercely defend their ancestral hunting grounds. And microscopic ant colonies conduct massive, coordinated invasions with the fiery enthusiasm of ancient empires combined with the terrifyingly cold administrative efficiency of a modern tax office. But human warfare requires something infinitely more psychologically complex. It demands that individual people coordinate seamlessly with total strangers who are not even distant cousins, faithfully execute a shared, elaborate plan, willingly accept grave personal danger, nurse long-standing grievances for years, and genuinely believe that the collective group's grand success matters far more than their own immediate precious safety. In other words, before humans could successfully become organized, lethal enemies, we first had to become masterfully organized friends. Our ancient ancestors evolved within intensely, almost suffocatingly social communities. Daily survival depended entirely on generously sharing food, collectively caring for screaming children, constantly exchanging juicy information, and weaving complex social alliances. On our own, a lone human is not especially impressive. We embarrassingly lack sharp claws, natural body armor, terrifyingly enormous teeth, or even the basic evolutionary dignity to stay warm without awkwardly stealing another animal's fluffy fur. But pool several of these hairless humans together, gift them with the power of language, and suddenly they can enthusiastically plan a deadly ambush 3 whole days in advance. Language was absolutely crucial because coordinated, large-scale violence depends entirely on gossiping about and discussing things that are not actually happening in the present moment. You must clearly identify a target, agree on precise timing, assign specific tactical roles, and persuasively explain to everyone why they should risk their lives to participate. A simple punch merely requires a sudden flash of hot anger. A strategic military raid, however, requires a tedious committee meeting. Long before the invention of shiny metal swords or formal standing armies, early humans already happily possessed highly efficient hunting weapons that could easily, with a bit of dark imagination, be redirected toward other human beings. Simple wooden spears, for instance, may date back hundreds of thousands of remarkably violent years. Later on, the arrival of sharp, Stone-tipped projectiles, elegant bows, and clever throwing weapons allowed sneaky attackers to seriously injure their opponents from a highly comfortable distance. This was undoubtedly a massive, celebrated technological breakthrough for bringing home dinner. It was also, unfortunately, extremely bad news for absolutely anyone standing on the wrong side of a prehistoric argument. Yet, weapons alone do not magically create war. A single spear can handily kill a wild animal, messy settle a petty personal feud, or bravely defend a sleeping camp. The truly decisive, highly dangerous ingredient is coalition thinking, that peculiar, dark ability to neatly divide the complex social world into a simple binary of us versus them. This powerful mental shortcut beautifully helped humans cooperate on truly remarkable scales. It wonderfully encouraged fierce loyalty, warm generosity, and heroic self-sacrifice within the tribal group. But, conversely, it also made terrified outsiders incredibly easy to fear, conveniently blame, and ruthlessly dehumanize. The exact same warm-hearted mind capable of tenderly feeding an entirely unrelated neighbor's child could quite easily decide that the mysterious people living just beyond the muddy river were not quite human in the same comforting way. Ultimately, organized war did not emerge because humans suddenly stopped cooperating. On the contrary, it emerged because we became terrifyingly, extraordinarily good at deciding who did and did not deserve our cooperation. The first wars probably did not begin with a dramatic announcement. No theatrical figure stood majestically on a slippery wet rock to loudly declare that the neighboring valley had gravely violated some prehistoric version of international law. More likely, the agonizingly slow path toward warfare began with perfectly ordinary day-to-day survival skills. Early humans had already become remarkably skilled hunters by meticulously reading faint tracks, cleverly predicting animal movement, stealthily surrounding unsuspecting prey, approaching with absolute silence, and striking decisively at precisely the right moment. These highly coordinated abilities demanded immense patience and seamless teamwork. Everyone in the band absolutely had to understand the plan, because one single confused, daydreaming hunter could easily turn a potential dinner into a terrifying stampede of angry hooves. Then, at some point in our muddy history, those exact same highly polished skills were pointedly aimed at another group of fellow humans. Perhaps a group of total strangers unceremoniously wandered into a particularly valuable hunting ground. Perhaps a bitterly dry season desperately forced several rival communities toward the exact same shrinking river. Perhaps someone greedily stole some hard-earned food, mysteriously abducted a person, or violently killed a member of another roaming band. We cannot possibly recover the original petty argument from the mists of time, but we can easily imagine its basic timeless structure. They took something from us. That deceptively simple sentence has enjoyed an alarmingly successful, multi-millennial career. A small, disgruntled group seeking bloody revenge might stealthily follow its enemies, wait patiently until several strong adults were safely away, and viciously attack the camp by surprise. If the sneaky raid succeeded, the traumatized survivors would certainly remember. Impressionable children would grow up repeatedly hearing stories of who had been brutally killed and which neighboring group was solely responsible. The inevitable next attack would no longer be about that original, forgotten theft. Instead, it would be a furious response to the previous retaliatory attack. Revenge, it turned out, had brilliantly discovered the magic of compound interest. This is one highly plausible way in which isolated, sporadic violence could easily spiral into a self-sustaining cycle of endless raids. Absolutely no permanent, tax-funded army was required. Hunter-gatherers could effortlessly assemble temporary fighting parties, launch a quick attack, and then promptly disappear back into the vast, protective landscape. Extreme mobility made sustained, large-scale conflict incredibly difficult to maintain, but it also made the terrifying element of surprise delightfully easy. An aggressive enemy did not need to painstakingly conquer your entire territory. They only needed to catch you when you were completely vulnerable. The introduction of projectile weapons dramatically increased that nagging vulnerability. Pointy spears and sharp stone-tipped weapons had originally been developed primarily for hunting, allowing clever humans to wound dangerous, toothy animals while maintaining at least a slightly more reasonable and comforting distance from their sharp teeth. Against other humans, however, this distance offered another highly attractive advantage. An eager attacker could fatally injure someone well before the poor victim could even begin to respond. Technology itself had not suddenly become evil. It had simply become highly transferable to new, more human targets. Still, raw competition alone does not automatically produce full-scale warfare. For the vast majority of our long prehistory, neighboring groups probably traded friendly exchange partners, shared valuable local information, and sometimes gathered together for festive celebrations. Cooperation was often vastly more profitable and far less exhausting than constant fighting. Violence always risked painful injury, immediate retaliation, and the tragic loss of valuable people whom every small community desperately depended on. But certain annoying environmental conditions could abruptly change this logical calculation. Shared water sources, seasonal fishing hotspots, rich hunting corridors, or unusually productive patches of fertile land could naturally concentrate both hungry people and limited resources. When something incredibly valuable could not easily be divided, or when one particularly greedy group firmly believed it absolutely should not be divided, the primal temptation to defend it grew exponentially. The very first war may therefore have quietly begun without anyone actually understanding that a brand new, terrible kind of behavior had officially appeared. To the participants, it may have just looked like another standard act of revenge. Then, unfortunately, it happened again. Bones, unfortunately for historians, are highly inconvenient and terribly quiet witnesses. They absolutely cannot tell us who started the silly fight, what the greedy attackers actually wanted, or whether somebody had spent 20 long years turning a minor, forgotten fishing dispute into sacred, non-negotiable family history. But they can, with chilling accuracy, record physical violence. One of the most historically important sites is Jebel Sahaba, a remarkably old cemetery sitting near the mighty Nile in what is now northern Sudan. The unfortunate people buried there lived roughly 13,000 years ago, right near the freezing end of the last major ice age. When curious archaeologists first studied the ancient remains, many skeletons clearly showed severe injuries associated with sharp stone projectiles, and the quiet cemetery was widely and dramatically described as definitive evidence of an ancient, brutal massacre. Later research, however, made this simple story significantly more complicated. A highly detailed, painstaking re-examination of the bones found more than 100 previously unidentified, partially healed injuries. Many individuals had wounds from arrows or spear-like projectiles, including tiny, stubborn stone fragments still quite stubbornly embedded deep in their ancient bones. Absolutely no one was spared this prehistoric hostility. Men, women, and even children were tragically affected. Yet, rather curiously, some of these nasty injuries had completely healed long before the final curtain call of death, while others had decided not to. Now, that little detail actually matters quite a bit. Instead of one singular, colossally bad afternoon of an enormous battle, Jebel Sahaba may instead represent a series of miserably repeated episodes of violence generously spread across these poor people's entire lives. A lucky individual survived one terrifying attack, patched themselves up, healed, and then, rather inconveniently, encountered violence all over again later in life. This strongly suggests a thoroughly exhausting, extended pattern of sneaky raids, sudden ambushes, or bitter territorial conflicts, rather than just one single catastrophic afternoon. The cemetery, you see, does not conveniently give us a grand army. Instead, it reluctantly hands us a depressing, endless cycle. Environmental pressure may have very well contributed to this ancient misery. The majestic Nile Valley was undergoing a massive, messy makeover as the Ice Age slowly ended, and various human groups were likely competing rather aggressively for prime real estate, food, and scarce water. That explanation is highly plausible, but unfortunately, skeletonized bones do not come equipped with handy weather reports or convenient sticky labels explaining the murderer's motive. While clever archaeologists can easily identify the physical injury, the actual motive remains most frustratingly and stubbornly invisible. Then, of course, we have the grim tale of Nataruk, situated near Lake Turkana in sunny Kenya. Around 10,000 years ago, a peaceful group of hunter-gatherers met their end there under decidedly violent, unpleasant circumstances. Intrepid researchers eventually uncovered the scattered remains of at least 27 unfortunate individuals. Several of them exhibited remarkably severe head injuries, while others showed nasty wounds apparently caused by rather sharp weapons or pointy projectiles. One poor adult even had a sharp stone point permanently lodged uncomfortably near their skull. Quite disrespectfully, some of the bodies appeared to have been casually left precisely where they fell, rather than receiving a proper, formal burial. This diverse group included both adults and children, and most tragically, one woman was heavily pregnant. It is exceptionally difficult to look at that grim forensic evidence and politely imagine a mere friendly misunderstanding over tea. The original researchers interpreted the tragedy at Nataruk as a brutal massacre carried out by a rival group, possibly during a highly aggressive raid for prime territory, vital food, or precious resources near the scenic lake. If this grim assessment is correct, it dramatically demonstrates that collective, highly lethal violence existed among nomadic people who lived peacefully by hunting, fishing, and gathering, long before pompous agricultural kingdoms began sending naive young men to die over arbitrary, brightly colored rectangles on maps. But, in true academic fashion, Nataruk remains fiercely debated. Skeptical critics have loudly questioned whether every single individual actually died in the exact same chaotic event, and whether some of the skeletal damage occurred peacefully after burial rather than at the terrifying, precise moment of death. That nagging uncertainty is not an embarrassing weakness in the field of archaeology. Indeed, it is the very essence of archaeology. Jebel Sahaba and Nataruk do not provide us with a neat, celebrated birthday for the invention of war. They offer us something far more brutally honest. Haunting glimpses of ancient communities constantly facing repeated, terrifying attacks, sudden, merciless killing, and existential danger from their fellow humans, thousands of years before the invention of crowded cities or expensive standing armies. The silent bones vividly remember the violence. They just stubbornly refuse to explain it to us. The central, agonizing problem here is not whether prehistoric humans occasionally killed one another, for they clearly, and rather enthusiastically, did. The real, head-scratching problem is deciding exactly when mere killing officially crosses the line to become war. If one angry person attacks another during a heated argument, we call that a standard homicide. If several hot-tempered relatives take bloody revenge on another rival family, we might label that a family feud. If a sneaky group ambushes unsuspecting strangers, it could be categorized as simple raiding. But if those terrible attacks repeat relentlessly over generations and engulf whole, angry communities, then many pedantic researchers would finally call it warfare. The ancient bones, unfortunately, show absolutely no respect for our tidy academic categories. A nasty skull fracture may have come from honorable combat, stern punishment, tragic domestic violence, a clumsy accident, or perhaps just one prehistoric fellow making a spectacularly, monumentally poor decision while standing a bit too close to a cliff. A clear arrow wound certainly proves that somebody was unfortunately shot. However, it stubbornly refuses to reveal whether the sneaky shooter represented a grand coalition, an angry family, or merely himself having a very bad day. This is precisely why highly opinionated scholars continue to disagree so vehemently over sites such as Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba. The fierce disagreement is not simply about the physical injuries themselves. Rather, it is about what those gruesome injuries actually allow us to boldly claim. Some ambitious researchers prefer to use a remarkably broad, all-encompassing definition of warfare, which they define simply as organized violence between members of separate rival communities. Under that extremely generous definition, even a small, highly coordinated raid by a few hunter-gatherers might easily qualify. On the other hand, more skeptical scholars demand far stronger, undeniable evidence. They want to see repeated attacks, distinct, clear group identities, obvious territorial motives, defensive structures, highly specialized weaponry, or unmistakable patterns indicating that the violence was a socially organized endeavor rather than just a series of highly personal, passionate brawls. Basically, this intense scientific debate boils down to asking whether war, metaphorically speaking, requires officially designated uniforms before we can formally call it war. Naturally, preservation introduces yet another massive headache for researchers. Highly mobile hunter-gatherers, bless their souls, frequently buried their dead in rather casual ways that leave practically zero archaeological evidence for us to find today. Furthermore, countless ancient remains were ruthlessly destroyed over time by relentless erosion, hungry animals, aggressively shifting rivers, or simply thousands of years of geology behaving exactly like an extraordinarily clumsy, unpaid intern who was somehow given keys to the fragile archives room. Consequently, this means that a total absence of neat mass graves does not automatically prove a blissful absence of conflict. Yet, making the opposite mistake is just as dangerous. Eager researchers cannot simply stumble upon every single fractured skeleton and immediately construct an entire, wildly imaginary invisible war around it. Archaeology, as a discipline, works infinitely better when multiple, distinct clues neatly align. Unmistakable weapon injuries, telling demographic patterns, evidence of repeated physical trauma, highly unusual body placement in graves, strategically defensive settlements, and clear, undeniable evidence that the attackers deliberately targeted more than just a single unlucky individual. Then, of course, there is the vexing question of actual cause. Severe climate stress is a very popular go-to explanation among scholars. As local environments changed, desperate groups may have anxiously crowded around shrinking rivers, drying lakes, rich fishing grounds, or any reliable food sources they could find. While acute scarcity could certainly increase fierce competition, such hardship can also, quite surprisingly, encourage cooperation, peaceful exchange, and timely migration. After all, a sudden drought does not automatically trigger an armed war any more than a completely empty family refrigerator automatically produces a violent, midnight household coup. Surging population density might matter. Highly valuable resources certainly matter. Bitter revenge, paralyzing fear, social prestige, and deep-seated territorial identity may all play their parts. The brutally honest answer is that different historical conflicts almost certainly had vastly different causes. There may never have been one singular, dramatic eureka moment when otherwise peaceful humans suddenly sat down and invented war. Instead, this destructive behavior may have popped up repeatedly, like a bad rash, whenever social cooperation, lethal weapons, strong group identity, and fierce competition combined in just the wrong volatile proportions. Thus, war may not be a single clever invention at all. Rather, it is a highly toxic recurring recipe. Farming certainly did not invent human violence. It did, however, make the simple act of walking away from a fight exponentially more expensive. For highly mobile hunter-gatherers, annoying conflicts could sometimes be easily avoided by simply packing up and moving to the next valley, another winding river, or a different, peaceful stretch of coastline. Of course, that was never an entirely simple journey, especially when fertile land was scarce, but physical mobility always offered a handy escape route. Farmers, unfortunately, had fields, and as we all know, agricultural fields do not travel particularly well. Once hard-working communities invested long, grueling months of backbreaking labor clearing stubborn land, planting crops, building sturdy houses, raising noisy livestock, and carefully storing precious grain, their territory became far more than just a convenient place to sleep. It became a physical monument of accumulated work. It became survival itself, neatly packaged into one specific, highly vulnerable piece of ground. And then, inevitably, came the concept of ownership. A well-stocked granary was incredibly useful because it allowed people to survive a harsh winter or a sudden drought. However, it was also, quite frankly, a giant wooden billboard that loudly announced to the world, "We have lots of delicious food, and it is all conveniently stacked right here in one easy-to-rob location." Settled life created valuable resources that could be proudly defended, formally inherited, meticulously counted, easily stolen, and tragically burned. It also supported much larger populations living in incredibly close, intimate quarters. More people naturally meant more fruitful cooperation, more bustling trade, more complex marriage networks, and, statistically speaking, infinitely more opportunities for one touchy neighbor to become deeply and permanently offended by another neighbor's poorly placed fence. By the time we reach the Neolithic period, the stark archaeological evidence for highly organized, collective violence becomes painfully difficult to politely dismiss. At the site of Talheim, located in what is now modern-day Germany, lucky archaeologists discovered a haunting mass grave dating back to roughly 7,000 years ago. This grim pit contained the skeletal remains of 34 people, tragically including men, women, and young children. Many of them had suffered absolutely lethal, crushing blows to the head, most likely delivered by everyday working tools such as stone adzes. This grim scene did not resemble a fair, honorable duel between brave warriors. Rather, it looked like the systematic, brutal destruction of an entire community. Another significant site, Schöne-Kilienstätten, also situated in Germany, revealed at least 26 unfortunate victims belonging to the very same broad linear pottery culture. Their horrific injuries included badly crushed skulls, nasty arrow wounds, and quite deliberately broken lower legs. The chilling pattern suggested not only killing, but quite possibly a grim buffet of torture, deliberate mutilation, or the highly organized prevention of escape. Whatever dark tragedy occurred in those quiet valleys was deeply personal, meticulously planned, and shockingly organized. Similar unsettling discoveries scattered across Neolithic Europe strongly suggest that some early farming societies experienced brutal raids, horrific massacres, and endless, exhausting cycles of blood revenge. Entire peaceful settlements may have been utterly wiped out. In certain eerie cases, young women appear to be conspicuously missing from the piles of the dead, raising the deeply disturbing possibility that captive brides or laborers were forcibly taken away. Warfare was gradually becoming messily entangled with land ownership, hard labor, prestigious family lines, and political social power. Ambitious local leaders could rapidly gain status simply by organizing a clever defense or executing a highly successful raid on the neighbors. Defensive fortifications began to pop up everywhere. Communities diligently dug ditches, built high walls, and erected sturdy wooden palisades, which are, when you think about it, essentially architectural ways of shouting, "We absolutely do not trust the sketchy people outside our gate." Violence, too, could become highly ritualized. Brave warriors might gain glorious prestige. Revered ancestors could conveniently justify the next round of revenge, and wretched enemies could be effortlessly transformed into convenient symbols of everything threatening the pure group. Once bloody conflict entered sacred tradition, collective memory itself became a potent weapon. The hated enemy was no longer just the annoying person attacking today. It was the entire rival group blamed for what tragically happened decades ago. The very bogeyman children were warned about at bedtime, those scary outsiders whose mere existence helped define exactly who we proudly were. Farming proudly gave humans permanent homes. Unfortunately, it also gave burning revenge a very specific, permanent mailing address. Today, of course, highly advanced war looks absolutely nothing like the simple skirmish of Jebel Sahaba. It boasts sophisticated satellites, silent drones, heavily encrypted communications, massive industrial supply chains, and quite frankly, enough mind-numbing bureaucratic paperwork to make a Neolithic raiding party reconsider the entire violent project and just stay home. But while the deadly machinery is shiny and new, the underlying psychology remains hopelessly ancient. Modern states can effortlessly mobilize millions of complete strangers by masterfully convincing them that they belong to the very same imagined group. Colorful flags, stirring anthems, identical uniforms, national myths, arbitrary borders, and highly creative national histories magically turn people who will never actually meet into a cohesive us. That peculiar ability can, quite amazingly, produce extraordinary levels of cooperation. It can build towering hospitals, heroically rescue entire cities after devastating disasters, and somehow persuade millions of tax-paying people to willingly contribute their hard-earned money to build smooth roads that they will immediately and loudly complain about anyway. Can also, with chilling ease, identify a hostile them. Our deeply ingrained coalition instincts certainly did not vanish when humans built complex governments. Instead, they simply expanded. The tiny village grew into the Grand Kingdom, and the Grand Kingdom became the mighty nation. The cozy campfire story eventually became the official heavy history textbook, now complete with brightly colored maps. Even completely harmless modern behavior hilariously reveals how quickly this ancient mental machinery activates. Enthusiastic sports fans proudly declare, "We won." despite having spent the entire match lazily slumped on a couch holding a half-eaten block of cheese. Highly dedicated online communities form fierce alliances, aggressively patrol their digital boundaries, brutally punish any internet defectors, and launch massive, coordinated raids against rival comment sections. Absolutely no stone spears required. Thankfully, this does not mean that total war is some sort of biologically inevitable trap. Humans are not hopelessly stuck inside a prehistoric software command forever telling us to attack outsiders. The very same clever species that coordinates massive armies also writes peaceful treaties, establishes international institutions, fosters global trade networks, and designs sophisticated moral systems that beautifully expand the definition of who actually counts as one of us. That, perhaps, may be the real, profound lesson of war's messy and murky beginning. Violence is incredibly ancient, but so is the quiet art of restraint. Fierce competition is ancient, but so is patient negotiation. Our resourceful ancestors survived the harsh ages not only because they fought bravely, but because they generously shared their food, peacefully exchanged partners, warmly adopted lost strangers, and cleverly built lasting alliances across strict group boundaries. There was probably no single historic Tuesday when humanity officially invented war. There was no proud first general, no grand opening ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a slow, gradual, and highly dangerous discovery that our wonderful talent for cooperation could be turned outward as organized violence. A tightly knit group could plan together, remember together, fear together, and, tragically, kill together. But human history is not simply the dark story of that terrible discovery. It is also the much more hopeful story of humans repeatedly, stubbornly trying to enlarge that warm circle of cooperation until fewer and fewer people remain shivering outside of it. So, when did ancient humans actually start going to war? Long before the first cities, and long before the rise of kings. Perhaps it began as soon as we became capable of looking at each other and saying, "These are my people," which means war is ultimately just a rather dreadful family tradition after all. Luckily, the truly excellent news is that families can indeed change.